Yo, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to this week's latest episode of Can I Kick It FC. It is your host, as always, Yogi. I'm back in the studio with a couple of my cool friends, and I think we have probably the most domino effective story in European history. We're gonna phase it that way. So we're gonna talk about a team that probably impacted the culture before we even knew what the culture in soccer was. We're talking about Louis van Gaal's Ajax team. We're talking about how great it was, some of the stuff behind the scenes you didn't know. Also, we're going to mention a little bit of what could have happened in the course of soccer history and why Chenier might cry, because there is a world in which Dennis Bergkamp ends up somewhere else besides Arsenal, and Edward van der Sar doesn't end up in Man United. It's all crazy. It's all confusing. It's Monday night, and I'm tired, so this podcast might get loopy. But I say all that to say, to introduce my co-host starting over here by my side is Mr. Jermaine Scott. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. Glad to be back. Shout out to y'all for holding it down. Last episode, brilliant episode, and crazy episode considering the departure of Ernie Stewart. But that was last episode, so let's stick on this episode. But yeah, very happy to be back.
Yeah, nice to have you back, man. Pleasure. We had to do all the heavy lifting when you were gone. For those who don't know, our last episode was on Ernie Stewart, who, by the way, now is out of a job.
Well, no, he got a job.
Is it? Do we call this failing upwards, or is this like, no, you deserved it?
It's the better gig right now.
Yeah, right.
Probably true. Probably is. Well, probably is. Next, we have, as you heard her lovely voice, is it one half of Shea Butter FC or 1/3 of Shea Butter FC?
It's still half.
Okay. All right. Well, one half of Shea Butter FC. It's Miss Sills. How are you doing, homie?
I'm here. It's busy times, but I'm here. Glad to be here.
When is it not busy times for you?
Not in education. Not really at all right now until this break comes. So.
Because right now we're going through end of the semester, so now I have kids coming up to me. It's like, hey, so you know about that F? We changed that to an A, and I'm like, no, absolutely not. Like,
at all semester,
you had time, and I had seniors. Like, literally, their only senior project for this semester is a 5-page paper on a person that changed sports politically. I had one kid come to me yesterday. So about that paper, can I get an extension? Sir, we're in second semester. You don't get up my face and stop playing with me?
Yeah. That's how it goes, though.
It annoys me. And the guy who just hopped back on screen, and also remember, folks, you can donate to Can I Kick It FC. Link is in the bio down below. With that money, we're going to help Chenier have better internet. How are you doing,
I'm doing all right. I'm finally back in. I just gave up and decided to try and use my phone. Hopefully this does a lot better.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, the ongoing joke between Can I Kick It and River City 93 is that Chenier internet at some point is going to let him down. It's just a matter of when. So if you want to take bets of when it happens again, feel free to do that.
Living in the sticks, man. Gotta. There.
You live out there in Farmville, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's outside of me DBA. Let's go ahead. Let's jump into it. We're talking about this great team here. This Ajax team, and this is just the highlight of it, the 1994-95 season. But I think this team, Jermaine, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of starts is climb up the hill. 1991, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Louis van Gaal takes over in 91. And we really see, Louis van Gaal kind of implement his style of total football into the team, right? And specifically, I think what's most interesting about that team is, the midfield, right? I think in a couple of episodes we were talking about the importance of black midfielders, right? And here in this Ajax team, you have two of the greatest black midfielders in football in history with Edgar Davids and and Clarence Seedorf, kind of just really controlling not just the midfield, but really the team, right? And so we could talk a little bit more about the individual players, but we're seeing kind of this climax of Ajax throughout the early 90s with this undefeated season of the Champions League.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, Shanera, you would know the pain of Louis van Gaal ball being a Manchester United fan, man. But I think I think this is where Louis van Gaal really gets his glow up as I am this tactical mastermind. Because for those who don't know, Louis van Gaal is a product of total football in a sense. But I know there's beef between him and Cruyff, which I'm interested in slightly enough. I'm wondering if Louis van Gaal can slug Cruyff, or not vice versa. Who are you taking in that fight?
I'm taking Cruyff.
Really?
I'm taking Cruyff. Cruyff is known for bringing some unexpected stuff to a fight. He will bring some unexpected stuff to any type of competition. He's going to throw a curveball at you at any moment. Van Gaal is quite predictable.
Yeah, this is also true.
That's fair. But he has a wild side to him, which I feel like gives him that edge.
Cruyff to me just looks like all length and smoker lungs. And Louis van Gaal looks like he'll prepare for 20 hours just to figure out when to perfectly land the right hook. But it's got to be a precise movement, because if not, then he'll get rid of you like Romario. Don't get that later. I feel proud of that too. All right, I'm sorry. Janir, Louis van Gaal, this Ajax team set up tactically wise was Louis van Gaal's baby child. You can see how perfect this team fit all together. But it was a different Ajax team setup because they got rid. Louis van Gaal moved away from the 4-3-3 and moved kind of to this 3-4-3 dominance. Explain it more, because I know you understand.
Yes. Louis van Gaal brought something completely different in terms of the lineup. He really threw a curveball, especially when you look in the finals, in the Champions League finals, where he had basically a diamond four in the midfield, 3 up top, 3 in the back. But the crazy thing was, your 2 outside center backs also almost doubled as outside backs. And it was kind of weird, because when you first look at the formation, you're like, okay, there's no outside backs, there's no wing backs, because in this situation you're looking at a team where your midfield is Rijkaard, Seedorf, De Boer, and Davids. None of them are wingers. None of them are fullbacks. And your back 3 of Reisiger, Blind, and Frank De Boer, they're all kind of center back, central defender players. So De Boer and Reisiger, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but De Boer and Reisiger, they kind of doubled as fullbacks, and which allowed the concentration of the possession and the concentration of the ball movement to be between those 4 in the midfield. De Boer, Davids, Seedorf, and Rijkaard. So it was very different, and I mean, it was tough to cope with. It was really, really tough to cope with.
Yeah. Are you about to say something, man?
Oh no, I'm just really admiring this picture.
It's a dope picture. So, I want to ask you this: obviously, you see Louis van Gaal, very young, looking very dapper and dabbing. I'm pretty sure somewhere in their photo that's a cigarette. It's bound to happen. It's early 90s.
Either that or a glass of wine.
Probably so. If we look at Louis van Gaal in this premise of what we know him as now, is this very prudent, very strict tactical manager, this guy that was very bullish towards the media. How do people look at him in the beginning years of an Ajax in 1991? Because if you read some of the stuff back then, it was kind of like, hey, who is this guy? Why are we hiring an assistant? He doesn't have any managerial experience. How did he go from that point to leading arguably the greatest Ajax team since Cruyff's Ajax?
What's the question? What's the question on
Well,
that?
I don't know.
Well, basically,
Basically, the question is, how did Louis Van Gaal make this team work?
Well, I mean,
well, I think one of the biggest things with Ajax that has always been very different from other big clubs, other Champions League winning clubs, is the ingrown talent and the youth development. I mean, over the years, Ajax, even to this day, Ajax is just churning out talent. It's just like a talent mill where players are coming out of that academy. The only academy in Europe that is considered maybe at this point to maybe be better than Ajax's academy is Clairefontaine in France, where your Thierry Henry, Paul Pogba, and N'Golo Kante came out of, and you know, the Nicolas Anelka. So you're looking at a situation where they are always going to be willing to take a chance on a manager because they know they have that talent coming through. They know they have that academy that is going to just churn out talent.
I agree, and I think sometimes it's almost easier to take a risk on a young manager when you have that academy structure. And I think that's what they did. And it's, while he didn't have any managerial experience, right, he had a good idea of how tactically total football worked, and Ajax wanted to stay in that same vein. And so the learning curve was there, but it probably wasn't as steep as somebody else's learning curve would have been, surprisingly. And with that setup, he could make mistakes and figure it out as he went. And the expectations weren't high either, right? Like, exceeding expectations wouldn't have been as hard for him, though again, clearly at the beginning it was pretty rough, and people had a lot of gripes. But I think when you hire somebody like that, like, it gives you a couple of seasons to really get it right, and that's what he got, and it worked out.
Yeah. No, it really did seem like he got it worked out. 91 season, man. When you go look at that roster, you kind of see some of the greats of, like, soccer as we know it now. Like, Dennis Bergkamp, for instance, was on the team. He got to start in that 91 team. And then what? I think 92. No, my fault. 91 was his breakout year because he had 6 goals in all competitions and whatnot. Leading into the 92 year, it's kind of like, you know, this is Louis Van Gaal's second year. They win the KNVB Cup, but you lose Dennis Bergkamp and Juan Jonk to enter. But in return, you get Frank Rijkaard, Fred George, and Harry Litton. Like, that's a good trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, and keep in mind that Rijkaard is coming from Milan, right? Who just is tearing it up in Europe, right, during the late 80s, early 90s. So he's coming back to Ajax. He's coming back home as kind of this veteran, right, to help lead the team. And so I think it kind of speaks to, you know, Van Gaal's kind of tactics, right? I mean, not tactics, but like how he thought about his team, right? He understood that this was a young core group of players, right? Kind of like this new generation of Dutch players. But it also had to be balanced, right, with kind of this veteran leadership that Rijkaard provided.
Yeah. I mean, I think I saw the stat. I think kind of fast forward, but that Champions League winning team, I think the overall age of that team was, I think, like 24. And I think the only 2 old people on the field, excuse me for saying old, because now I am not officially old. I feel it every day I wake up. But the only 2 veteran players on that team were Frank Rijkaard and Blend. That was it.
Right. Yep.
Like, that's incredibly hard to hear and believe, man. You know.
Yeah. If you look at like Seedorf, I think he's like 19, 18, right, starting, right. David is like 21, right. So it's a young group of it's definitely a young group of players, and I think that adds to the excitement about the team, right. It's a youthful, energetic group, right. They're out there to get it. And I think we see this kind of undefeated season, right? In 95, both in the domestic league and in the Champions League.
All right.
So I want to pause right here and ask you guys this question. It can be open up to anyone, but with this young black core at Ajax, and we're talking prior to the win of the championship, don't get to that point yet, but his young core team is coming together, but there's a lot of black talent in this team as well. Like, how do you think the city, like Ajax itself, and also the kind of like Netherlands were kind of looking at this team and like, you know, were they excited about them? Were there like reservations? You know, how was the temperament around this team?
Well, I think around this team there was a lot of anticipation because I think, like we were talking about, when we talk about this 94-95 season, where Champions League, you're looking at that's the peak of that era under Louis van Gaal, that era of Ajax where you know you have Dennis Bergkamp, and Dennis Bergkamp eventually leaves, and you have this Ajax for the past 3-4 years is on a steady incline until you reach this 94-95 season where they literally take the world by storm. So I think when we're getting up to there is this sense of, okay, what is this team going to pull off this year? Because last year was insane. Last year was crazy. You do still have, like we talked about before, on the side, a lot of the racial issues that were going on with regards to the players on the team and feeling unfairly treated and things of that nature. But there's one thing that I noticed that really doesn't change much. This notion of, oh, well, let's just play football, you know? And at the end of the day, you're looking at a situation where the success kind of overshadowed the struggles a bit. And so the struggles became personal. It became more of a personal thing than more of a let's put this out there to the world, because at the end of the day, regardless of how well, unless it's extreme, most of the times, regardless of how much you feel that you're being mistreated, who wants to ruin a good thing? You're winning games left and right. You're dominating Netherlands, and you have one of the greatest academies in the world. So even though, and I think it's the reason why a lot of those players after this season, they're like, all right, we got our success, we had a great season, but I still don't like what's going on here, so I'm going to check out and go somewhere else.
Yeah, for sure. Like in the early 90s, a lot of the Dutch media, it was weird, right? Like the Dutch media is racist in a lot of different ways, right? So on the one hand, they're like, you know, wow, like the success of the Ajax and the Dutch is really being energized by this youthful, you know, young black group of players, right? And then all of a sudden they quickly go into, and these black players come from Suriname, which was a colony of the Netherlands, and you know, they are descendants of slaves, and so it just goes into like this really weird like anthropological discourse about like where these people come from, and then like in the like 1994, 1995, they start having like these studies basically about why these black players are so good. Like, yo, why are these black players balling out right now? And some of the studies is just wild. They literally go back to like racial science, right? Like, yo, like black people actually have faster twitch muscles, and from the days of slavery they you know, achieved this great strength that they are now able to use in the contemporary period, right? And it's like really like this is like what's being discussed in like Dutch newspapers during this time. So it's quite it's quite disturbing, right? But similar to the contemporary moment, right? This obviously that racial science piece is still there, but it's not as overt, right? But what is similar to the contemporary moment is, of course, when they're playing well, right, they're getting the praise, but then when they're missing penalties and they're not playing well, that's when they get the criticism, right? And so and by criticism I mean like racism, right? Like straight up, like, yo, what are y'all doing?
Yeah.
Y'all not using your heads to play the game, right? Like that type of racial discourse. So it's really
it's the two extremes.
Yeah. Yep.
It kind of goes like Oh, what you want to say, Shannon? My bad.
No, I was gonna say, you saying that, it just brings us back to the Euros 2 years ago or last year. Oh my gosh, COVID messed things up. The Euros, where everyone's for years on end, ever since he came out strangely under Louis van Gaal, Marcus Rashford is lauded as a young talent that's coming up and whatever. And for year after year after year, he's considered one of the great. Bukayo Saka, and then all of a sudden they missed their PKs in the finals of the Euros, and all of a sudden they're hated on. They're completely demolished. There is a side of that is just a European soccer fan thing, because we think about what happened to David Beckham when he got that red card in '98. Like, they were literally burning effigies of him in the streets. Like, it was insane. But this situation, it magnifies even more because they're inserting the race issue into it. And you're looking at this soccer passion that, okay, yes, we get it, one day a soccer player is an absolute hero, the next day he makes one slight mistake on the field and he's the complete villain. That's normal. That happens in with the passion of sports. But the insertion of race every time a black soccer player has a misstep on the field or has a misstep off the field, it's just it's a stark difference. And you saw that with this team. Thankfully, in this year, you don't see it much because, I mean, I think I guess we'll talk about that calendar year and how outrageously amazing that was. But thankfully, that year they didn't get as much of the criticism. But again, like you were saying, like the race science articles and stuff about that, it's like, why do we have to even talk about this? Why is this even a thing?
Absolutely right. Let's go ahead, let's talk about the team, man. This is the team that I think captured so many people's attention just because, one, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is probably the blackest team to win the Champions League. Like, I
think so.
I'm struggling to think of a team that's probably blacker.
No.
Like,
blackity black.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I can't think of one.
No, and I think one of the reasons why is because after this era, when you go into, and especially around the era right after the '98 World Cup, you have a big international mixing of soccer players on different top level teams. So like you look at Tottenham, they've got players from Asia, from Africa, from South America, from North America, from Europe, and you look at this team, they're basically all Dutch except for 2 Nigerians and a Finnish player. All of them are Dutch. Yes, there's Suriname. There's what other countries were there? There's Suriname. There's Congo. There's Congo. But dual citizenship. They are Dutch players. So you're looking at a situation now where you've got an influx of players from South America, and then later on, I think you need to start getting into the late 2000s to start seeing more Asian players, more Middle Eastern players coming into international soccer, European soccer, but I don't know if we're going to be able to get another team like this, especially not on the club level. On the international level, you said what?
I said the rate Chelsea's going, it might happen. They might buy up all of Africa and be like, one of y'all can win the Champions League. Go out there and do it. Absolutely.
Oh,
man. They're just literally... They're throwing darts at a map. Chelsea's literally just throwing darts at a map.
Hey, your man said, listen, if I'm going to get this penalty, I'm going to have a loaded squad before I get it.
Right. Talking about loaded squads, man. This Ajax team, Shanir, you brought up the point, man. This Ajax team, outside of 3 players, all was from the Netherlands. And I think not a cool way, but I think the way how you need to look at this team, man, this is literally the last great European team to be heavily featured of the country that they're in. Because that summer, 95, we get the Bosman rule, right? So if you go look at international rosters prior to the Bosman rule, more than 80% of that team is made up of that country. Right? Because there's no free agency, there's no movement amongst players. If you wanted to move, it was pretty much like, all right, we might sell you for some cash, but we getting something in return. It wasn't as if you were free. Say if you ran a contract with the team, you can then test the water to see like, oh, hey, can I get this contract, It was pretty much, no, we still hold your rights. And if we're cool with this team paying you, then what's up? If not, we'll just hold you in purgatory.
Yeah.
So this Bosman ruling, like we saw it, granted, they stayed together one more year, but you can kind of see this was the last team to be the host country. Like I think of the great Celtic teams that won the Champions League, the great Milan teams, the Benfica teams that were like heavily Portuguese. Like, how important was that to have pretty much like 95% of the team to be from the Netherlands? That was a question, but we'll move on.
No, it's not. But it was mad important, right? It was mad important, right? That and I think it was more important, not just for the club side, but for the national side, right? Where you have all of the national team players playing, not all of them, but the majority of them playing on the same team, right? Playing in the domestic leagues, right? So they're familiar with the system, right? Obviously, there's a relationship between the Ajax style and the national team style in terms of this total football philosophy. So it's incredibly important, right? But that Bosman ruling changed the game, right? And I think Davids was the first one to take advantage of the Bosman ruling once it was passed, right? He was like, "Yo, I'm out. I'm done with this," and he moved on to bigger and better things. But the fact that they were all together on the same team absolutely was definitely built the chemistry and help secure kind of the success that they experienced.
Well, yeah, let's look at the 94 team success, and then we'll come back to the Bosman rule and everything like that. So, fun fact about this team, if you ever want to win a history quiz or anything, they are the only team to win a Champions League going undefeated in their domestic season. Team played 34 games, won 27, drew 7. I want to ask you guys this question, see if anyone knows. Do you know how many goals they scored in the Eredivisie that year? Without Wikipedia. Don't use Wikipedia.
I don't.
Yeah, I can't tell you.
How many games they played? 34. You talking about domestic?
How many?
Domestic.
I think it was over 100.
It's got to be over 100.
It was over 100.
It was
precise number.
I don't know, 134.
I'm trying to remember.
Oh no, it's not that high. It would be crazy if it's that high. It's not that high.
It was like just above 100. It was like 105 or something.
Right, I was gonna say 104.
106.
Oh wow.
Scored 106 goals.
That's crazy.
Only let in 28. And we're talking about the defense of Frank de Boer, Blend, White Card, and the other center back is now escaping my mind right now. Oh God, he's gonna kill me. But yeah, that whole defense only let in 28 goals the entire time.
It was Reisiger.
There we go, Racing. Yeah,
Or at least he was the one in that Champions League finals game. But throughout the season, I guess of course, it's dropping and changing. You can't play every single game.
right.
Yeah, speaking of that, shout out to Winston Bogart, who was also in that back line sometimes, kind of interchanging in and out. A very dope player, another very outspoken player in terms of the injustices that they experience at Ajax.
Yeah. We'll kind of speed through this part because we need to talk about some of these injustices, man. But the only game they lost that year was in the KNVB Cup. It was a quarterfinal game against Feyenoord. The team won the Dutch Super Cup against Feyenoord, oddly enough. Champions League group, they played Ajax, they played Milan, Casino Salzburg, who never heard of that team before, but the fact they got Casino in their name sounds pretty cool to me. And then AEK Athens. Dominated that group, finished top of the group. Oh, guys, this is another thing. I want to ask you guys this question real quick. How many points did you get for a win back in the day?
2.
I want you to know how badly my head was hurting when I was looking at these group stages. I was like, they have 10 points, but they have 4 wins. And 4 wins doesn't equal 10 points. Yeah. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And for like a good 30 minutes, I'm sitting here like really trying to do math and like, this doesn't make sense. And then I realized, like, oh, now they were 2 points.
Game has changed, man. Yeah.
Word.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah.
But on the run to the Champions League, they played Hajduk Split, beat Bayern Munich. And I think if this result happened in today's world, matter of fact, it did happen. When y'all guys remember when Ajax beat Real Madrid, we were all like, oh, this team is good.
Yep.
Yeah. They beat Bayern Munich 5-2 in Netherlands. And that's insane to me. But yeah, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, Ajax is always in the conversation.
Yeah.
They're always in the conversation in the Champions League, even if they're having a down year. They're gonna make it. 9 times out of 10, they're making it past the group stage. Every once in a while, they'll end up third and they'll drop into the Europa League. But there is a consistency with Ajax, and I think when you look at this team and what this team did, it's kind of that benchmark. Because if you look, for example, let's look at American sports and let's look at school sports.
Right.
You're like how a school ends up being a staple in maybe the NCAA. NCAA is not because they just have a good, because you got to think about it. A player is not going to be playing there for more than 4 years. After 4 years, they've graduated, bye, gone. That's it. But they keep churning out. If you look, for example, the UConn women's basketball team,
right.
It's like every year, it's like who's going to come in second because we know UConn's going to win. So, so you have this situation where they had something so big that now everyone is like, that's the place to go. That's the place to go. That's the place to put my kids. That's the academy to put my kids in, for my kids to train in. And that's when you have this talent continuing to come out. You have your Van Persies. You have you have the second generation of this team. Kluivert, Lind. These are literally the children of the ones that started this. And it's like, no, they're going to where it started, and it's just one of those things that it feeds itself because of it started here. The system feeds itself by starting with such a phenomenal year as this that literally turned the eyes of the entire world.
I want to pivot courses real quick, and I want to kind of drive you guys into this conversation because I'm interested in hearing all your opinions on it. Is it fair to say that this Ajax team is kind of like the start of, I guess, black soccer love? in Europe, almost in the sense of like you have this very recognizable team of black talent, Clarence Sheeter, Frank Rijkaard, Edgar Davis, and whatnot. But it's also like so many of these guys went on to do major things in the European stands that you also have this boom happening of where black fans are starting to like, oh, it's not like I've recognized some of these guys on these great teams. You know, there were individual black players that did great things on other teams, but to my recollection, it's kind of like that first team to really be quote unquote all black. What do you guys think? Or your thoughts on it?
Yeah, like for me, Ajax has kind of always been like, oh, this is a team black people root for. Like it is, right? And I think that is directly tied to the legacy of those early mid-90s teams. Like they were the one European team that just had a bunch of black dudes on it, right? And they were good. And so yeah, I don't think that's coincidence, right? Like particularly black people of a certain age, like we're all like Ajax fans. Like one, they have good kits too, but like yeah, like I think most black people of a certain age, particularly like millennials and stuff, Ajax is kind of their team. You know what I mean? Like there are other squads obviously, but they're the one that I think no matter what, they're like the common denominator. Like that's the squad. We like how they played. We like what they look like. Yeah, I don't know. That's always the impression that I've got as long as I've watched people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, like to Sylv's point, right? It's like my introduction, or my first memory, I should say, of Ajax, but really the Dutch national team is the '98 World Cup, and just seeing not just one but two players with dreadlocks on the team, right? With Seedorf and Davids, right? So it's like, whoa, like these players are black, but they're like oozing like black culture, right? Like they're like very
every black person on the team had one stereotypical black haircut. Like you had the locks, you had Cliver with the jerry curl. Somebody had a fade.
Yeah,
it's the phases of black hair. Everyone had a little bit of something in it.
Yeah, outside of the Dutch team, Kobe was the only other person I knew who had like any kind of locks.
Who had locks? Yeah. He was the only other big name one. Yeah.
Right, and at the same time, right, also going on in Europe, you got Ruud Gullit that's going to Chelsea, right? He becomes the Chelsea manager, right? So there's this really great concentration of like black Dutch excellence, if you will, whatever. Black Dutch excellence, not only in the Netherlands, right, but throughout Europe. That's really just taking European football by storm.
And now that you mention it, now the more that I think about it, you know how now we talk so much about how like France is kind of like the team of Africa. Like it's very easy for black people to root for France because you see the likes of Paul Pogba and N'Golo Kante, Kylian Mbappe, you know, these black faces that are really representative of the culture, and they represent the culture as well. Do you feel as if, and I know we just talked about how black people was kind of looking at this ISC was kind of like their gateway and whatnot, but sometimes I kind of feel like there's this weird pushback with the Dutch Netherlands team and players accepting their blackness. Like sometimes you never truly hear them and say like, "Oh, yes, I'm Dutch, but my mother's from Suriname or whatever." Like you hear it from French players or from the English players, and then people can feel connected to them. Why is it like this hesitance or this pushback with black players or black fans at the Dutch national team?
Well, I think it started there, and I think you're looking at a situation where there's this sense of, oh, you should be a patriot. You should, you shouldn't be saying that. You're Dutch, and you need to represent as Dutch. And it's basically that decade's version of criticizing the kneeling for the national anthem. Basically, so you're looking at a generation. They're like, well, yeah, I have a Dutch passport, but my family is from Suriname, or my family is from Curaçao. I mean, it's interesting because I remember I did this once because I'm a soccer nerd. I actually went through a lot of the great players from countries like France, the Netherlands, England, and Germany. And I said, okay, if I were to take all of these players and have them play for the country of their parents' birth, Germany would be crap, France would be crap, Netherlands would be complete crap, England would be complete crap. And it's like you see this international inflow of, and of course, yes, you're looking at it as, okay, this is basically the immigrants coming in and the second generation immigrants representing that nation. Instead of embracing that and embracing the fact that, oh, we have all of these different cultures in our country, there's this sense of, let's subdue that. No, we're France. No, we're England. You're English. You don't need to talk about where your parents are from. You're English. When at the end of the day, you need to look at it like, yeah, look at how great our country is. Everyone wants to come here. Look at how international our team is. And I think that's one thing that you see a little bit more for the U.S. men's national team than you see for all of these other countries. You see the U.S. men's national team more so embracing the diversity that they have than these other countries. There's still a long way to go. Don't get me wrong. But I think in terms of just looking at a situation where you have so many players. I mean, one of the great, even though he's persona non grata right now, when you look at some of the players that are awarded, Captain Claudio, he's obviously not your typical Caucasian with a name like that. Yeah. I think with this team, I think this was a good way, with the success that they had, to force these countries to think about it differently, to force the people to think about, okay, yes, I'm black, yes, I'm Dutch, but my parents are from another country and I still want to keep that. And I still want to be able to embrace that side of my culture. Yes, I'm putting that orange jersey on when World Cup time comes around, when World Cup qualifications match come around, when the Euros comes around. But I still have my roots. I still have my ancestry that I want to respect. And with the level that they reached, they're able to convey better. And I think that's why things have slowly started to change with that. It started with this team.
So I saw the wheels going off in your head now, so I'm gonna give you the floor. I know you got something great to say.
No, I think it's super interesting. I think some of it is it's Europe. Like, it's just at the heart of it, football is very much the sport of immigrants, right? Like, it is the sort of unifier. If you're coming from one place and going to another, it's like math and music, right? Like, it's this universal language. You don't have to speak the same language to be able to play football with somebody. We see it all the time. But yeah, I think it's an identity thing in Europe. It's really interesting, right? You've seen that pushback, like you said, from England, right? When you had 3 black players miss PKs, and it very much became this animus that had way more to do with it just being, oh, you missed, but they were black players that missed. You got that pushback from France, right? You get a lot of like nationalistic pushback even with that team, despite them winning in 2018 and damn near winning in 2022. And their best player being a young 22, 23-year-old young black man, right? Who is French, unapologetically French. But he's also the son of somebody from Algeria, right? It's essentially, I know we don't use Berber anymore, but his mom's a Berber, his dad's, from sub-Saharan Africa. Like, it's really... I think Europe struggles with it in part because, unlike the US, who needs those players, right? Like, we're working clearly on growing our domestic talent. That's not to say we've never had great domestic talent. We've had great players, but I think we're a lot more willing to not compromise, but I think embrace that, dual national or multinational, what have you. team because we need them.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, is it
Yeah, I
just
think you can also. I was saying I think you can also equate that to the immigration era of the United States, like where literally everyone from Europe was coming to the U.S. It's like, okay, we're a melting pot. Let's just own it.
Right, Luther was literally born here on like his parents' vacation or something and went back to England. Like, it's a very finite amount of time.
So, if I'm hearing you right, it's pretty much that places like France, England, U.S. even, they're a little bit more accepting of it. Like, you're allowed to be French, but you're also allowed to be Black. Where the Netherlands is more so like, no, you're Dutch. That's it. You just happen to be Black.
Well, yeah, to some extent. I mean, the Dutch have their own very unique history, as do most of those European countries that colonized other people. And I think it's going to be pushed back no matter what. Also, people don't want to be confronted with the history of their country when it's not great, right? Like, those faces represent a whole lot of bad things that people did. Because why are they in your country, right? Like, they can't really work anywhere else. Like, yeah.
It's like, I'm here because you messed up my country.
Like, all right, cool.
Jermaine, you made an extra point before we started recording, man, about how a lot of this team and a lot of the Black talent kind of looked at their paychecks. It was like, it's kind of like that classic meme of, you getting paid how much? And then the guy behind him was like, we getting paid for this? Like, explain that part a little bit more, because I think there's a really fascinating part. It kind of encapsulated with the whole Bosman rule thing that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, so I want to answer that question, but I also want to hop in on that previous question, because I think there's excuse me, I think there's a number of different levels to this, right? So on the one hand, we can look at fans and ask, is there a disconnect between fans and the Dutch national team? Is there a disconnect between like fans and kind of this black Dutchness? And if there is, right, we can make the argument whether or not it is or isn't. But if there is a disconnect, I think a lot of that comes from the fact that these are Surinamese Dutch players, and Suriname isn't as readily available in our minds as, say, like an African nation that was colonized by France or England, right? So Suriname seems a little foreign to us, kind of in our kind of colonial history, right? Like, we don't really talk a lot about. I mean, just before the episode, we're like, "Yo, who did the Dutch colonize?" Like, it took us a while to like figure that out, right? So I think that's
something we just can't figure out who.
Oh yeah, no, that Dutch West India Company was very real, very much part of that slave trade. So there's that level of kind of fan disconnect. I will say that the players themselves, they walked a fine line, and I think they did a really good job balancing that dual nationality, right? So on the one hand, yes, they played on the Dutch team. They were very open about it, like, yo, we are Dutch. We grew up in the Netherlands. Like, we know Dutch culture. But on the other hand, there were times, and this is kind of going to your second question, Yogi, is that at times they did, right, like acknowledge and recognize their allegiance to Suriname, right? Like, Patrick Kluivert in one interview says, like, everyone knows if there was a Surinamese national team, things would be a lot different, right? Like, he says that, right? Like the players know, like, they're very much aware of their Surinamese background, and they're trying to balance that dual nationality, right? And I think the struggle of balancing that, which is kind of what we see throughout Europe, is this idea of like multiculturalism, right? So the Netherlands is all about, we are a multicultural society, right? Like let's all exist as one. The problem with that is that part of multiculturalism is that those other cultures then get absorbed into Dutch culture, right? So it's no longer Surinamese and Dutch culture. It's Surinamese under Dutch culture, right? So they're trying to figure out how to balance being Dutch, also representing Surinamese culture, right? During the 90s, they actively are generating conversations about Dutch history, right? As Sylv said, no one likes talking about, like, these European nations are not going to take the initiative to talk about their colonial enslaving past, right? So these players energized that conversation during the 90s, right? Especially when you have moments, and this is to your second question, especially when you have moments where after the Champions League, all of the, if I'm not mistaken, I think all of the black Ajax players leaves, right? A large part because of this Bosman ruling, right? There's more freedom to move at the end of your contract or what have you. But they also express that they felt undervalued at the club, right? And so there was a report that came out during this time after the Champions League. I'm just trying to pull up the numbers to make sure I don't get it wrong, but they said that people like De Boer so it says the brothers Ronald and Frank De Boer each received £200,000. This is on the Ajax salary. Danny Blind received almost as much, while Edgar Davids received only £40,000. Seedorf and Kluivert collected £32,000, and Reisiger received £26,000. Right, and so it's a huge pay gap. Right, they are literally the core of the team. And after the Champions League, they start getting all these different offers from Milan, from Juventus, from Sampdoria, like millions of dollar contracts, right? Like $1 million contracts. And so there's this open discussion, this public discussion about all of these black players. Like, yo, we're out, we're leaving. Y'all don't value us as, and they make it very explicit. We feel like y'all are not valuing us because of our Surinamese identity, right? Because of our Surinamese background. They're very explicit about it, right? And so they just did, right? And so that's just like one instance of kind of racial injustice or kind of discrimination against these black players that to Shanir's point, we don't really hear about because it gets suppressed in the name of the team, right? The team is winning, they're winning the Champions League. Why are you going to make all of this public? On the flip side, it becomes public in '96, right, with the Dutch national team in the Euros, but that may be further down the conversation. But yeah, so there's a lot going on in the Netherlands. And I think it's just a kind of looking at the specificity of the Netherlands, right? This kind of Surinamese connection, the multicultural bit in the Netherlands, but also the players being very vocal and public and passionate about their dual identities or their dual nationalities.
And I mean, to your point as well, is like you kind of look at where this team went. And also, it's kind of weird to see where a lot of these guys went because it makes you realize like how great of a power Italy was at this time, because I think like 7 or 8 guys went to Italy alone.
Yeah. So he's not a Milan fan. That's where everybody went next, man.
Like 7 to 8 guys. Went to Italy. I think 2 guys went to Barca, 1 guy went to Arsenal. So it's like you kind of see where the influence of power was at that time just by looking at some of the transfer deals. I mean, this team. Even constructed such a great team that they kind of almost run it back again in '95. Going with winning the Eredivisie, but losing the Champions League final to Juve, who, funny enough, hasn't won a Champions League final since '96, which is hilarious. Right, and looks like they're about to get relegated again to
Works for me.
All the stuff going on there, man. I want to pinpoint on this part. When we look at this team in history, how do you think the culture is going to resonate with this team? How do you think they're going to look at them? Their long-lasting legacy and impact.
I think they're going to look at them with a lot of praise, right? Like they're going to remember this team. Not just for their championship victory, but how they did it, right, and who they did it with, right? I mean, we've been talking this whole episode just about how black this team was, and I think it's a foundational point in this kind of black soccer history, particularly in the context of Europe, right? Like, not only are they good, but they're outspoken, right? Like they are outspoken, like they're cussing out coaches and all of like straight up cussing out coaches, and so. I think people will remember them for exactly that. Not only how hard they played on the pitch and their technicality, right? Their successes throughout Europe after Ajax, right? We can think of Seedorf and his just long list of achievements, right? Particularly in the Champions League. So I think that's how they'll be remembered, just as winners, but also as hella black winners.
I know you're great at seeing the underlying layers of a team, just more so outside of what they come together as the more so about their impact on and off the field. What do you like? What is the legacy of this Ajax team off the field?
That's a good question. I mean, I think for me, as far as club teams go, I think they're just, I don't say a cultural reset, but they are like they are the culture, right? Like I look at players today, or even players between that time and now, and like the ability to like be yourself, be unapologetically Black, whether you're certain needs, like however that works, right? They had to navigate it a little bit differently, but I think it lays the groundwork, again, particularly in Europe, but I think across the board for Black players in particular to not assimilate, but like to not close themselves off, right? To be able to play the sport in a way that's true to them, true to their culture. Play it in a way that's free, and it still works in a team setting, right? Like, again, arguably one of the most dominant teams in a single year in Europe, and that you could play that way, and you could be yourself and still be successful, and that there's a multitude of ways to win at this sport, and I think they showed a very specific way, right? Like embracing the culture of total football. It's this very Dutch way of playing, but then them bringing their own cultures and their own personalities and perfecting it, and the youthfulness too, right? Like they're proof that you can win with young players. It's a risk. Like I'm not saying everybody should build a young team, but when done right and when you have all of these things line up, it can be incredibly successful. And like you said, if this team doesn't break up, if Bergkamp doesn't leave early, like a year before they win and all of this other stuff, everything looks completely different. But I think it's almost this kismet thing where you have this group of players, the vast majority of them, or a decent amount of them, are Black in Europe at a time when that's not really happened from a league where people don't normally win Champions League, right? Like you said, at this time Italy is very dominant, right, in European football, and so and to do it domestically, right? To do it with quote unquote Dutch players, right? Players who are Dutch and something else. But I think it coalesces this national identity around you can be Dutch in a bunch of different ways, and one of them is to be a bunch of Black dudes with different heritage, right? Who all ended up in this country and can play. And not everybody plays, right? Like again, we did our last episode on Ernie Stewart, who could have easily played for the Netherlands, but plays, for the US, and you have these different people in that country, but it creates an identity, and it creates a Dutch footballing identity. Like I like Dutch football, right? And I think that weirds people out. But then you mention Ajax and things like that, and you're like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense because they have Cruyff in their head or something like that. And I think they've redefined like what that is, and players after them, generations after them, can look and be like, I want to play like that. And I think particularly, just giving love to my midfielders, like it showed a generation of kids like, you can be a Black midfielder, you can be a boss. There's a million different ways to play in the midfield. We can do that, where I don't think that was always highlighted. So I think that's sort of the legacy. It's just a culture. You can be yourself and be free and win and play and be young and matter to the sport, not just when you're playing it, but long after.
Right. So, I mean, honestly, I think there's a good way of how to lead this podcast off. I mean, what it all sounds like we all came together on is this is a team that culturally was a little bit ahead of its time, to where the Black culture, the average Black soccer fan wasn't around to really respect and honor them. But this is a team where it kind of like, if you want to look for the start date, this is it. This is the 94, 95 Ajax team. It's kind of like the start of Black soccer fans kind of like looking at the team and be like, oh snap, I can play midfield with other Black people and win trophies. Kind of cool. And you kind of see how these guys done on and off the field in the course of their careers. So with that being said, listeners, we just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day and for listening to our show, because without you, we couldn't do this show.